Good morning, Grade 4. Welcome back to our first lesson of history for the term. Today in our lesson, we will be focusing on the arrival of the First Fleet and how this historical event impacted certain groups of people such as Indigenous Australians, colonists, and the English government throughout the colonisation of Australia. We will learn how the arrival of the First Fleet changed the ways of life for different people, especially First Nation Australians, whose culture, population, and connection to the land were strongly changed because of British settlement. When a group of people decide to move to another land and take over that country, they are known as colonisers. In 1770, Captain James Cook was the first British sailor to discover Australia and decided to claim the land as a part of Great Britain. Through this discovery, the English government decided to grow their powers to other parts of the world, so they decided to send prisoners that they did not have room for in England because of overcrowding in jails to Australia. So in 1788, British captain Arthur Phillip led 11 ships carrying 1,000 convicts to settle in Australia and colonise the country as British land. This event was known as the First Fleet. When arriving in Australia, Arthur Phillip sailed his ship to Botany Bay, New South Wales, to set up the first colony. However, the soil and weather conditions were not suitable to stay there. They actually settled at Sydney Cove in Port Jackson on January 26, the date now celebrated all over Australia as Australia Day. They called the whole area in which they settled upon New South Wales. Today, New South Wales is a state which is just below the state we live in, Queensland. It is important to take note of why some people might view Australia Day as a day of invasion. Some Australians may see January 26 as a day of invasion and may choose not to celebrate Australia Day. This is because on the day of January 26, 1788, Aboriginal land was taken over by British colonists. When James Cook first arrived in Australia, he considered the land as terra nullius, which means land belonging to no one. However, numerous Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people lived on the land for thousands of years, even before the arrival of English colonists. Before the arrival of the First Fleet in 1788, Australia was home to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples who were the first people to live in our country, making them one of the oldest living cultures in the whole world. As the first group of people to exist in a country, we refer to them as Indigenous. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, also known as First Nation peoples, belong to hundreds of different groups all over Australia. Each group had different languages, beliefs, laws, and traditions. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people hold very special connections to the land and have lived as hunters and gatherers long before the British arrival in 1788. Today in our lesson, we will look at an important interaction between a young Indigenous man named Bennelong and Captain Arthur Phillip, who lived through the experiences of the First Fleet. Through that interaction, we can explore how the settlement of the British changed the ways of life for Indigenous people, including their culture, environment, health, and population. Bennelong was a young Indigenous man who belonged to the Wangal people and was one of the first Indigenous Australians to form a connection with European settlers. Bennelong grew up by the Parramatta River with his parents, who named him after a fish. When he was just a baby, Bennelong's mother would fish from her ngawi, which was a canoe made of stringy bark, with him in her lap. When he was around 6 years old, explorer James Cook spent a week at Botany Bay after discovering Australia in April 1770. This was the first ever time the English had arrived in New South Wales, where Bennelong and many of his people lived. If we have a look at our slides here, we can see a traditional Aboriginal canoe used for fishing and hunting, and an axe also used for hunting and making things. As he began to grow up, Bennelong soon learnt how to hunt along the river, just like his people. Using spears called motting, made from Wangal peoples, he was able to spear wallamai, which was a type of fish that lived in the riverbank near his home. He also made his own nawi by using a stone axe called a mogo to take down the bark from a tree to make a canoe to help him hunt. By the time he was a teenager, he participated in many special traditions with his culture to show that he was a man. He could now hunt kangaroos and dingoes, and he could now find a wife. When Bennelong was about 24 years of age, British sailing ships brought the first fleet to the shores of Australia. These 11 ships carried 1,000 men, women, and children convicts to a Sydney cove where they settled to claim the land as a part of Britain. A convict is a person who has committed a crime and has been sent to jail. During this time, laws in England were very strict, and most people who were put in jail were poor. Their crimes were often for stealing food and clothing just to eat and survive. During this settlement in 1789, Bennelong's family caught European diseases, which were brought over by the convicts, such as smallpox, which killed half of the Aboriginal people, including his first wife. Settlers also brought over weapons like guns, where many Aboriginal people were shot and killed. This caused a lot of fighting between Indigenous people and the British, and many Aboriginals fought back by spearing and killing English people. On the 25th of November, 1789, Bennelong was abducted from his family and tribe by the English settlers. Abducting means to take away a person from their family or home. Many Indigenous people throughout the time of the British settlement were taken from their families, and many of them never came back. By the order of Arthur Phillip, who was the governor of the English colony, Bennelong was taken away from a gathering on the beach after being promised a gift of two big fish by an English man named William Bradley. During the time he was captured, Bennelong spent a lot of time with Arthur Phillip, learning a lot about British culture. He began to dress like the British and learnt English while teaching Arthur about his own language and culture. Bennelong then escaped from the British later on and returned back to his tribe. After looking at Bennelong and his relationship with the settlers, we can understand how First Nation Australians' ways of life were changed by the arrival of the First Fleet. Aboriginals were killed due to European diseases brought over by the English. Many Indigenous people, such as Bennelong, were captured and forced to become a part of English culture, and many Aboriginals were murdered by English settlers. It is important that we understand how this is a very important part of Aboriginal history and why some Australians view the arrival of the British as an invasion. When celebrating Australia Day, it is important that we are acknowledging the causes and effects of the First Fleet and how this history not only marks the colonisation of Australia, but the changes to traditional ways of life for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Thank you, Grade 4, for being such wonderful listeners.